חג אורים שמח, חודש טוב. יש לנו מתנה מקסימה לחנוכה באורח הכבוד שלנו. עורך דין בנימין ברפמן הוא אחד העורכי דין המובילים בתחום הפלילי בארצות הברית. הוא הצליח להגן על הרבה אנשים מפורסמים, והוא גם זכה בהרבה פרסים ועיטורים. וברשותכם אני עוברת עכשיו לאנגלית כדי להציג אותם. It's no secret that the media love crime news. Indeed, since the beginning of the mass media and the penny press, crime news has been a mainstay of newspapers, with law and order issues making up sometimes as much as 70% of the news. But some crimes or allegations of crimes are particularly attractive to the press. The allegations made by an African immigrant housekeeper against Dominique Strauss-Kahn had all that it takes for sustained media coverage. Sex, money, power, and yes, he's a Jew. And as we all know, Jews are news. How we all love stories about how the mighty have fallen, and the media supplied us with much information and images that convinced most of us that Strauss-Kahn was indeed guilty. The image of a confused Strauss-Kahn being taken off the plane by the police minutes before it was due to take off. The infamous Perp Walk. The equally infamous Time magazine picture of a pig on its cover in its coverage of the case. The graphic descriptions of all he was accused of. The empathetic coverage of the vulnerability of the victim. All undermined any presumption of innocence we might have entertained. All the hype and drama came to a rather ignominious end for both the press and the legal authorities by the time the prosecution dropped all charges against Dominique Strauss-Kahn, accompanied by criticism and serious debates about the role of legal actors and the media in celebrity cases. The man responsible for this turnabout, in this case and in the coverage, is our guest speaker today. Advocate Benjamin Brafman is the principal lawyer of Brafman of Associates, Manhattan firm specializing in criminal law with an emphasis on white-collar criminal defense. Mr. Brafman, a former assistant district attorney in the Rackets Bureau of the New York County District Attorney's Office, has been in private practice since 1980. In 1997, Benjamin Brafman was selected by New York Magazine as the best criminal defense lawyer in New York. This was just one of the many prizes he has been awarded. He was the recipient of the Outstanding Private Criminal Defense Practitioner Award for 2005 from the New York State Bar Association. In 2006, Mr. Brafman received the Norman Ostroff Award for Outstanding Achievement in the field of white-collar criminal defense by the New York Council of Defense Lawyers. And in January 2007, Mr. Brafman was presented with the first ever Clarence Darrow Award for Distinguished Practitioner by the New York State Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. He has successfully represented a wide range of high-profile celebrities like Michael Jackson and Jay-Z, and prominent business leaders, lawyers, political figures, and professionals in major criminal cases throughout the United States. It is an honor and a privilege to present Mr. Brafman, who will talk about managing the media in high-profile cases.
Thank you very much. תודה רבה. שלום. אני רוצה לדבר עברית. אבל אני לא מדבר עברית כל כך טוב. So I'm going to speak in English. I'll try and say a few things in Hebrew so that for those of you who don't understand English, you will at least understand some of what I said. I find Israel to be a fascinating place. My children and grandchildren live here, so I am here very often. And I watched this symposium this morning, and I found, just like in America, I agreed with everybody, and I disagreed with everybody. And everybody said things that I think are correct, and everybody said things that I think I disagree with. But that is the way Israel is. I mean, I think you see I am wearing a kippah sruga, and in Israel that's an interesting thing to wear. אני chovesh kippah sruga. In some parts of Tel Aviv, I am a religious fanatic. In Yerushalayim, I am dati. And in Ramot Beit Shemesh, I am a goy. So Israel is an interesting place. And I think part of what happens in Israel happens in America too. And the reason it happens the same way in both countries is because we are a democracy. Both in Israel and in the United States, we pride ourselves on freedom and freedom of expression. And we pride ourselves on freedom of the press. And we pride ourselves on the accused having certain rights. Sometimes it doesn't look like we have those rights. And what I want to talk about today is the perception and the reality, how something appears to be and what the MS is. Because not always is the MS the perception. Many times the perception is not true or accurate, and it is very often the case that the search for the truth is neither the responsibility of the criminal justice system, nor is it the responsibility of the media. And what is true is often debatable. When someone is found innocent, they are not guilty. It is not a statement that they are innocent. And when someone is found guilty, there is much blame to go around. I feel badly for Dr. Feldman, because when you win, every decision you made is excellent, and when you don't win, every decision you made is criticized. If I didn't win the Strauss-Kahn case, I would not be standing here. You would not want as your keynote speaker the person who screwed up the Strauss-Kahn case. So what you have in this country, as we have in America, is a very difficult system and a very difficult media. And it is very difficult to manage, and it is very difficult to deal with. And I am told by people who are in jail that the worst day in prison is the day after you would be free if you had listened to your lawyer. So I think maybe Moshe Katsav has 7 years of bad days. Because in this case, from what I read, and I'm not going to talk about the facts because I'm not involved in the case. And one of the problems I find is if you just read from the media, you don't always know what you're talking about. Hardly ever, perhaps. But from what I understand is before there was a plea bargain. And the plea bargain, if he took the plea bargain, there would be no prison sentence. Nachon? And now he went to trial and he was found guilty and he was sentenced to 7 years. And I think one of the questions one might ask is, why? Same facts, same crime. Was he punished for going to trial? Was he punished for not willing to stand up and admit that he did something wrong? In our country, the same thing happens very often. You are encouraged to plead guilty. You are offered a very lenient sentence, for sometimes no jail. But if you persist and you maintain that you are not guilty, then sometimes there is a knas, there is a penalty that is much greater after the system is resolved. And that is a separate lecture, it's a separate discussion. It could be a separate seminar which could take days to discuss, and we would still have many questions. So let me stick to the subject matter. Let me talk about the media and managing the media. You know, there is a saying in Ivrit that if you are accused of a crime, what you are supposed to do is, you're supposed to, Adam lekaf, is that ladun, ladam lekaf? You're supposed to give someone the benefit of the doubt. It's a fiction. Because everyone in this room immediately assumed, except me, that Dominique Strauss-Kahn was guilty when he was arrested. And everybody in the world assumed that he was guilty, except me. Because I knew what happened. Not just because he told me, but because from the investigation we did, it was impossible that the claim as it was being made to be true. But we have a problem, and it's nobody's fault. It's easy to second guess, it's easy to point fingers. This is the problem. News happens fast. Scandal is the worst kind of news. We live for scandal. It's a bad commentary on society, but both in the United States, in Israel, in every country where there is a free press, we live for scandal. When there is scandal, we enjoy the lashon hara that goes with it. It's a bad quality, but it's a reality. We read the newspaper more when there is a scandal being reported. We buy more newspapers when there is a scandal being reported. We watch more television news when there is a scandal being reported. And if the scandal involves the president of Israel or someone who could be the president of France, I think the expression is kal v'chomer, we read more. It's more interesting, it's more exciting than if this was an Adam Pashut, if this was someone who nobody knew. Crime happens every day. The same kind of crime happens every day. And you don't have 500 members of the world media sitting in front of the courthouse, yom v'layla, day after day after day, waiting to hear one word about the case, waiting to take one picture. And in fairness to the prosecutors in the Dominique Strauss-Kahn case, yes, it's easy to say they made mistakes. It's easy to say that in Israel he would not have been charged. I don't believe that for a second, with all respect. Because if the same facts had presented in Israel, an accusation by a minority person against someone who is a powerful figure, who is on a plane getting ready to leave the country, you would detain him. Now maybe he wouldn't be indicted, maybe he wouldn't be charged, maybe you would do the investigation first. But in the United States, things happen in a minute. And the problem with the news media today, it's no longer a deadline, is it 6 o'clock at night, where a reporter has to have their facts, and you have 6 or 7 or 8 hours to do an investigation. Today we have digital media. It's instantaneous. Reporters were sitting in the courtroom, entering blogs while the facts were unfolding, and most of them were wrong. But like in Israel, like in the United States, the media understands that there is little, if any, accountability. I don't know the word in Hebrew, but they have little.
They haven't invented one yet.
Okay. The word is, the issue I discuss is in the United States, if someone writes a story about a public figure and they are wrong and they ruin their life, in order to me to sue them successfully, I must be able to show actual malice, not that they made a mistake, that they acted evilly, maliciously, or that they acted with reckless disregard for the truth. And the media does not have to disclose who their sources are. So if someone tells them this is what happened, and they think they are reliable, they will report it. And if they're wrong, you have no accountability. You have no ability to sue them. And if you try and sue a giant media company, you have to have millions and millions of dollars, and you have to have 5 years. Because it takes 5 years for a libel case or a slander case to make it from the beginning to the day you have a day in court, and then you may never be able to win. Because the reporters don't have to reveal their sources, so they don't even have to tell you who they were relying on. Therefore, what happens when you have a terrible, there are some mixtures, there are some ingredients you should never mix together. Sex, politics, white, rich, Jewish, poor, African American, made. You could not write a better script for reality TV. And then you have someone who's going to be the president of France, who is arrested on a plane, who has a diplomatic passport. You could not write worse facts for disaster. So kol hakavod to me and my colleagues that we were able to survive this ordeal. But let me tell you, people said to me, was it fun? Was it fun? And I say to them, when the case started, ani 2 meter gavoa. I was 6 feet tall. Every day they cut away from me. Every day I was dealing with a vicious, relentless media. It was much worse than any case I've ever been in because it was a world media. So when the United States press was going to bed, Europe was waking up. When Europe was going to bed, the United States was waking up. Ani shomer Shabbat. Im ani lo shomer Shabbat, ani mes. Because I have one day when no one can bother me. One day. It was cameras outside my house, outside my office. When I came to visit my children in Yerushalayim, they found me. Yediot Achronot found me, and they had a headline. I learned a lot of new words for what I do. I'm a farkilit. Farklit? I'm a farklit. I didn't even know what that was. But I saw a headline in Yehuda Achronot said, Farklit Brafman, hu Yehudi, hu Dati, hu Gaon. Now I have a brother who is a Rosh Yeshiva. He called me and he said, "You're not a Gaon." Ata lo Gaon. Ani Gaon. Ani Rosh Yeshiva. Ata lo Gaon. Ata Yehudi. Ata Dati Ma'at. Aval Halu. Ata lo Gaon. But suddenly I was the world's best lawyer. Why? Because I had a famous client. The case was not an important case. It was important to the woman who made the claim, but it was not an important case. It wasn't a political corruption. It wasn't a high white-collar securities fraud involving major companies. It didn't involve billions of dollars. It involved an allegation of sexual misconduct, and if he was not Dominique Strauss-Kahn, I would not be here. You would not know what this case is. So it wasn't the case. It was who the allegation was against. So I'm not suggesting it wasn't a serious allegation. But the media interest was never in the facts of the case. The media interest was because he was going to be the president of France, because he was the head of the IMF. And what was amazing to me is if you walk down the street in Manhattan, before his arrest, 98% of the people would not be able to tell you who Dominique Strauss-Kahn was. 2 days after his arrest, in every Starbucks, that's all they talked about was the DSK case. People would stop me on the street. They want to take my picture. They want my autograph. Why? Because the most important case in the world. I went to the tennis matches in New York, the US Open, and all of the French people were lining up to take pictures with me. In France, this is the biggest event of the world. And I was always amazed by this. And now we manage the media. How do you manage the media? Mr. Feldman said something, and he took some criticism from some of the panelists, that the difference is I had a client who listened to me. And to be perfectly honest with you, I did. With all his power, with all his wealth, with all his politics, and his wife, Anne Sinclair, who is a major journalist in Europe, one of the most prominent women today. She is given the Women of the Year award by a French publication. She is a very prominent, impressive person. So I had a very powerful couple. And I sat them down and I said, listen to me. You're having a heart attack. I'm a cardiologist. I'm trying to save your life. You have never been through this before. This is not business as usual. You cannot talk to the press. And they listened to me. Because you cannot say anything that matters, and anything you say you are stuck with for the rest of the case. And you have to live with, even if you want to change what you said based on new evidence from an investigation. So the only thing, if you look at all the interviews, the millions of interviews, and the millions of press clippings, and the video, the only thing you ever heard me or my colleague William Taylor say was that this case did not involve force. And therefore what happened in that hotel room was not criminal, and the rest is none of your business. And that's the MS. If there's no crime, what happened in the hotel room, while salacious, while of interest, while you want to know, it's really none of your business. And we did not move beyond that. We said nothing. He said nothing. He made no statements for 4 months. His wife made no statements other than to say, I stand by my husband, period. End of discussion. And we did not have a moment's peace, not 1 minute of menucha for 4 months. Every second of every day, the media were trying to drive us crazy. And I think the most important job is the discipline. The most important job I have in that climate is to maintain my focus. And this is something I said then, and it's something I said in the Puff Daddy case, and it's something I said in any case where the press was interested. I say to my client, listen to me. Just listen. I'm going to say this so that anyone can understand it. If you are trying to get a good press day, a good day of news, and in the process, you will lose the case, when you lose the case, no one will remember the good press day. If you have a bad press day, a very bad press day, but you win the case, no one will remember the bad press day. So you need to sit tight. You need to keep getting punched again and again and again and not respond. And regardless what is said, you cannot respond. It's very hard. It's easier said than done, and sometimes you have a public official who has the world of public opinion that he is worried about, not just the court. And then you have the dangerous mix, and I think that's what ultimately created a major problem for Mr. Katsav and also his legal team. I think he was more worried about the politics and less worried about the outcome of the case. And Dominique Strauss-Kahn, as was said on the podium, he immediately resigned from the IMF. Even though he knew he was innocent of the crime, I knew he was innocent of the crime because it would be impossible to continue as president of the IMF in this media, I call it a tsunami. It was a wave that was so strong, it wipes away everything in its path, unless you hold on to something very tight. I said, you cannot go back to Europe, even if I get you permission, and deal with the IMF issues. You will be a distraction. It's not fair to you, it's not fair to the IMF, and it's a stupid thing to do. And he agreed immediately, and he resigned. Now, as it turned out, his whole life has been changed and ruined, and he has not been convicted of any crime. But that doesn't mean he will ever get his life back. And that's what I think people really don't understand. When the media destroys a person, whether the outcome is guilty or not guilty, it's very hard to get your life back to the same place it was before. He would be president of France today. I think, believe it or not, Israel would have a very good friend in the French presidency if he were the friend. Instead of a Sonei Yisrael, you would have an Oev Yisrael. I think the minute he got in trouble, the entire European economy began to collapse. Look at the timing. All around his case, the economy began to collapse, because despite his problem, perhaps, with women, he was a genius with economics. That was his job. That was his genius. That's why this case, even though we are here and it's a great legal professional success, it's a disaster what happened in that case. And it's only because he is an Adam Chashuv. It's only because the media needs to get information out. I am not a critic of the media. I do not blame the media. I have been involved in high-profile cases for 35 years. I understand it. There is a right of the public to know, and the public has an interest in knowing, and in many cases, the media is very important to a democracy, because in cases of political corruption, in cases of government misconduct, it is the media who many times gets partial credit for uncovering the misconduct. But not always should the media be able to pat itself on the back. Sometimes, when they are wrong, they are really wrong, it doesn't matter. They say salachti. They don't even say salachti. They print the new story as if the old story was never printed. The same newspaper that had him in handcuffs and calling him la perv, the pervert, when he was dismissed, said DSK free man, cleared of all charges. That was a headline That sold newspapers. That was newsworthy. That was interesting to the world too. So the same media that destroyed him now announced the success as if they were part of the reason for the success. They took credit. And what was also interesting to me is that while we were very disciplined and we tried very hard not to speak, and sometimes it was very, very hard, it was very, very difficult. And you also, it becomes, you know, you think you're a star. You think suddenly you're a movie star. The Today Show, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, France 224, the BBC. I was invited by Al Jazeera. They called me Al Jazeera. And to them I had an answer. I said, you're the last people I'm going to speak to. I have children who live in Yerushalayim. You're not helpful. But I was invited by everybody. Suddenly I was a rock star. And it goes, if you allow it, it can go to your head, and you can suddenly allow yourself to be dragged along, and then you do a disservice to your client. If you will notice, the woman who made the complaint in the Dominique Strauss-Kahn case, she was on TV, she was interviewed, she gave statement after statement after statement, and she led to her own destruction as a witness, because every time she spoke publicly, she told a different variation of the events, and she was criticized, and ultimately, everyone gives us credit for discrediting her. She ultimately discredited herself. And the difference between, I will tell you one fact which was not mentioned up here on the panel, talking about the DSK case. And I'm not telling you because it matters, the case is over. The interesting part about the DSK case is he was not guilty. The interesting thing about the DSK case is a crime was not committed. For those of us who know the intimate details of what actually happened, he should not have been prosecuted. The reason he was prosecuted was because, one, there was a complaint made that sounded terrible. Two, he was on a plane. And then because they were afraid if he got to France he would never come back, everything happened very quickly. And when you have an African-American poor working woman making an accusation against someone who is a high-powered, Jewish, wealthy, powerful person, it's a terrible combination of facts. And the explosion happened. And once the explosion happened, we had to simply, when an explosion comes, you have to stand still until you figure out where it's safe, because you don't know where the explosion is coming from next. And I said to them every day, we will ultimately win the case, but you cannot rush a criminal justice system that prosecutes 100,000 cases a year. You cannot swim against, if you surf, if you swim, if you've ever been in the ocean, sometimes you have to let the wave pass over you. If you try and fight the wave, you will drown. So you have to wait till the wave passes. The people who survived the tsunami either had something to hold on to, or they were underneath the water, or they were inside, or they hid, or they were able to let it pass. And then they came out, and then there was a recovery. But that's very hard. It's very hard every day when you are a DSK or a Moshe Katsav, and it's very hard if you are a public figure and you have a family and you have children and you have grandchildren. It's very hard every day to read something if you disagree with it. And sometimes you have to be smart, because you cannot take a public position where you know what you're saying, zelo emet. Because eventually the truth does, in most cases, come out. And then not only are you a bad person, then you're also a liar. And for the advocate, for the lawyer, I think the one thing I have in the United States with the media, with the court, is I have credibility. If I speak accurately, and if I choose not to speak, that sometimes is also very eloquent speech, because I'm doing my job first, and then I will speak later. And sometimes I do my job, and then I have a lot to say, and sometimes I do my job, and I don't have a lot to say. And I think the mantra of managing the media is to not let it overtake the case. There is a case, and there is a media. And what's happening in the case is in the courtroom, and what's happening in the media is many times out of your control. Out of your control. I can tell you I have 100 cases where when my client was arrested, it was the front page. When they were found not guilty, it wasn't even in the newspaper. Scandal sells. If you add politics, it sells more. If you add sex, it sells a lot more. And if you add race and stature and money, it sells and it sells and it sells, and suddenly anything you say is wrong, or anything you say leads to another question. So if I say there was no force used, end of discussion. If I say there was no force used, and then they say, so tell me what happened, you cannot continue that discussion, even if your client is not guilty. And if you do, then what you have is, if the case doesn't work out, and if the case does go to trial, and if the case does change, and if you develop new information and there's new investigation, what you've said early is used against you, it's used against your client, and you are second guessed. And I said to Mr. Feldman, when you win, every time you make a decision, you're a genius. If you lose, every time you make a decision, there are people after the fact who have the luxury of 3 years and 2 years of discussion and investigation, and then they criticize you. So it is a very hard job. It is a very hard job to be a criminal defense lawyer. It is a very hard job to be a criminal defense lawyer in a public case. It is a very hard job to do what we do under the best of circumstances, because generally you're meeting a client at his worst moment. It is worse than being told that you have cancer. I'm going to repeat this. Being charged with a crime publicly is worse than being told that you have cancer. Because when you are told that you are sick, everyone supports you. No one criticizes you. No one abandons you. It is not humiliating to become sick. It happens. When you are charged with a crime, even if you are guilty, you are going through the worst time possibly imagined if you are not a career criminal, if you are not someone who has ever been in trouble before. If you are a career criminal, you take these things in stride. It's the price of doing business. It's something you get used to, believe it or not. But if you've never been in trouble, and your whole life suddenly is turned upside down, and you lose your job and your reputation and your career, and you are worried about your freedom, it is a nightmare. And then if you are public, and every day the newspaper is printing things about you that are not true, it's very hard not to want to speak out. It's very hard for your lawyer not to want to come to your assistance. So when the title here is Managing the Media, I think managing the media, the best thing you can do with the media is understand the media's job. The media's job is to report the current news. The current news, not the accurate news. The current news, the news of that moment, the development of that moment, how best I perceive what the news is at that moment. We are in a time which is the best of, as you know, there's a wonderful book by Charles Dickens, A Tale of Two Cities. It begins, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. My grandchildren are growing up in the best of times because they have technology that it wasn't even imaginable when I was a child. So it's a blessing, but it's also a curse because they have misinformation at their fingertips instantly before any parent can even know what they are looking at or what they are reading or what they are hearing or what they are seeing. And editors who are running after reporters are no longer talking about a deadline at 6 p.m. at night or the next day or for the weeklies would close on Thursday. Now the information has to be fed instantly. Every reporter sits in the courtroom with a laptop. I watch them. I watch a reporter from French TV reporting instantly what's going on. I said to him, why don't you wait until the end of the proceeding? It will be a different blog in 40 minutes. He said to me, because the people from my competitor newspaper are blogging at the same time. And if my feed doesn't get to my editor when their feed gets, I hear about it. the next day, that I was late. They have a rush to judgment. And society is not without fault. All of us have a little bit of an achrayus in this regard, because I will bet you that everybody in this room, when the case of Dominique Strauss-Kahn broke, everybody in this room immediately assumed that he was guilty. How could someone so powerful be accused if he was not guilty? One woman is saying, not me. Good. So a lot of people were suddenly, and then all of the stories about past issues began to surface. And suddenly, it was as if I was representing Hitler. Suddenly, he was such a bad guy. I mean, I remember one Sunday, a reporter from one of our tabloids. Tabloid is a newspaper that doesn't really care whether they get it right or wrong. But a tabloid calls me, and he said, I have to ask your comment on something. I said, what? He says, we have a source that tells us that within 18 hours before his encounter with the maid, Dominique Strauss-Kahn had 3 sexual partners before her. What do you have to say? I said, Kol hakavod. How do you respond to this? There was no allegation of criminality. There was no allegation that he forced himself, that he had raped these women. There was a question. Suddenly it was of interest to them, and women were coming forward. I mean, if all of the women we interviewed and investigated really had sex with Dominique Strauss-Kahn, he'd be 200 years old. But people were coming out of everywhere because they wanted to be part of what was the sexiest case in the world, the sexiest case of the hour. And I will tell you something else of interest as a Jew, what I found. I don't know if there are any members of the French media here. In France, there was another sidebar to this story. Me. My friends who were traveling around Europe that summer were bringing me back copies of articles. And in every magazine, Dominique Strauss-Kahn was on the cover, and inside there was a story about me too. And the story about me, you know what was of interest to the French media? That I was a Yehudi. That I was a Jew representing a Jew. And it was much more important then for me to win this case, because God forbid I should give France another reason to hate Jews. So suddenly there was a dimension to the European press that who is this Jewish advocate who shows up on all of these high-profile celebrity cases? So people said to me, was it fun? It wasn't fun. It was interesting. At the end of the day, it worked out well. So I look back on it that was successful, and I am proud of the work that we did, but it wasn't fun. It was tension, yom v'layla, 24/7. I think Dr. Feldman said how many times he wakes up and thinks, second thinks. I didn't sleep for 4 months. Because for 4 months, the question was, should we answer this question? Should we have a press conference? Should we do this investigation? Should we do this? And the prosecutors in this case, they were all my colleagues. I was in the Manhattan District Attorney's office. I respect the people who run that office. The people who are doing the investigation, I've known them professionally for 30 years, many of them. They're not bad people. They're doing their job. And they were also dealing with a rabid, a very fierce, very purposeful press. Didn't want to know the end. They wanted to be able to sell the next day's edition. So it wasn't a question when it was over, who should I blame? It wasn't a question who should get the credit. At the end of the day, what happened, and it's an interesting case which has never been the subject of a symposium. I've spoken on this case many times, and I've spoken on the prosecutor's role, I've spoken on the defense lawyer's role, I've spoken on the court's role, I've spoken on the media's role, I speak here today on managing the media. At the end of the day, the human drama involves a person and a family. And whether you like his personal behavior or you don't like his personal behavior, that's not the issue. The fact is that someone was accused of a very serious crime throughout the world. It cost him his career, his job, his legacy, the highest office in his country. And at the end of the day, it was a false accusation. Now, the prosecutor who spoke on the podium before, she said, we would not have charged. We would have done our investigation first. and I hope that you are right. However, let me say this to you, that the people who did this investigation, who charged Dominique Strauss-Kahn, are very ethical, very good, very professional, very experienced, very talented prosecutors. But what they had to deal with is instantaneous world outcry in a case with a foreign national who was not a citizen of the United States, who was arrested on a plane, and the accusation was made by a woman who appeared to be honest. It took weeks till a lot of the information about her story was developed. So their position was, look, we did the honorable thing. And to be honest with you, in the end, they did the honorable thing. And I say kol hakavod to District Attorney Vance in Manhattan, because you know what? Not in every case does that happen. There are people sitting in prison. There were people sitting on death row in cases where prosecutors made a mistake but didn't have the courage to admit, and fought and fought and fought despite overwhelming evidence that they were wrong. So to take the highest profile case in the United States and stand up and say we are dismissing the indictment takes a great deal of courage, and it takes a great deal of integrity. So there's blame to spread around, and there's credit to spread around, and it's easy to do it. But because the focus of today's symposium is managing the media, let me give you some of my rules before we end, so that at least you take away a few items from my perspective. One, it's almost impossible to manage the media. So I think the title needs to be adjusted. You cannot manage the media, because the media is not manageable when it is either a Katsav or a DSK. You need to survive the media. You need to deal with the media. You need to be able to look yourself in the mirror and say, I did my job and I did it right, regardless of the media. So I don't think you can ever manage the media. I think you need to deal with the media. And I think one of the ways you deal with the media is you have to understand one rule: the media is not your friend. I have had very nice articles written about me by members of the media. But the minute I screw up, they will write a bad article about me. So you need to know that in a criminal case, the media is not your friend. Whether you are a prosecutor or a defense lawyer or the one who is accused, the media is not your friend. You can trust certain reporters, and certain reporters do have high standards of personal ethics, and many reporters do try their best to get it right, and I have respect for many, and many are my friends, but they too will tell me in moments of quiet confidence that sometimes the time factor is so much pressure that they are forced to write before they are completely comfortable. And the competition is very fierce. So they must compete. And when you compete, sometimes the rules don't change, but some of the rules, they bend a little bit. So my rules for dealing with the media are: you have to watch everything you say. Everything you say can come back and hurt your client and you. It can damage your credibility with the court, and it can ultimately damage your client's case. So the achrayus you have as an advocate is not, is Ben Brafman going to look good in tomorrow's newspaper? The achrayus I have is, my client going to look bad if I say something? If I say something to make them look good, am I compromising my own ethics, or am I ruining my chances of being successful? Because contrary to what people believe in the United States, lawyers are bound by ethical rules that prohibit you from saying certain things that may impact on the outcome of a case. The very few lawyers follow those rules, I'm sorry to tell you, but I follow those rules, because when I say something to a court, I want the court to know that he's dealing with an honest advocate. I want the judge to know that when I finally do say something, I'm trying my best to be accurate. I'm trying my best not to just be slick or quick. I'm trying to be accurate. So I think what we need to understand from both the Katsav case and the BSK case, that the media can be good, it can be bad. Sometimes it's very good, sometimes it's very bad. But in a democracy, and Israel is the only other real democracy that matches, in my opinion, the United States, where we are equal on all levels in terms of the freedom of the media. I think it's very important to a democracy that we have a free media. I think it's very important to the United States and to Israel that we don't try and discourage the press from reporting. I think you need to have news. You need to have them do their job. All I suggest is that everyone, one, in the media has to act with the same responsibility we demand in every other profession. And I think also you need to understand that what you read in the media is not always completely accurate. And the last subject I want you to raise, which is another subject for another symposium, which is a current problem both in Israel and in the United States. In the United States, it's a greater problem because we have jury trials, you have judge trials. We assume that our judges are not influenced as much by the bias of the public and the media. With jurors, I worry. And the problem we have now is it used to be that judges would say, don't read anything about this case while you serve on a jury. And you would hope that they wouldn't read the 3 newspapers in New York that cover the case. Now a juror goes home in the privacy of their own home. They Google. They put in your client's name. They learn everything about that person since they were born. They put in your name. They learn everything about you since they were born. No one knows that they are doing this. And many of the things that they read and they learn would never come into the courtroom and would be inadmissible for a jury to hear, and it would not be permitted for them to know. And we worry that trials sometimes now are being compromised by jurors who use outside material rather than what's in the courtroom. And to be honest with you, other than relying on the integrity of the juror who swears that they're not going to do that, there's no way to police that. You know, you can take away newspapers, you can urge them not to buy it, but in the privacy of the home, you have people who will tweet and Twitter and find out that you're on a jury and give you their opinion in 15 seconds. And then what do? You report them to the judge? Most people don't. So I'm honored to be invited. It gave me an additional reason to come to Israel to celebrate Hanukkah and to see my children and grandchildren. So thank you for this invitation. I'm honored to be here, and I wish you all a Chag Sameach and a Chodesh Tov. Thank you.
Would you be willing to take some questions? I'll go away and let you handle this.
Mr. Brafman, what you closed with raises serious implications for the whole jury system, because this problem is only going to get aggravated over time. I mean, are there any thoughts of ameliorating this?
Well, what the Bar Associations in New York and the United States are actually forming committees to study the problem. Judges are now including in their instructions to jurors that there are obviously social media sites are off limits if you serve on a jury. And in the United States, we generally have to rely on jurors to be honest and true to their word, even when there was just print media or radio or TV. And I'll tell you something about our jury system. I was a prosecutor for 5 years, and I've been a criminal defense lawyer for more than 30 years. The system generally works. The system generally works well. Works well here, and it works well in the United States. The prosecutors win 90% of their cases in Israel. The prosecutors win 90% of the cases in the United States. Generally, people who have done something wrong are either plead guilty or they are found guilty. And in the cases where we are able to find someone not guilty, it's because there is a reasonable doubt in the evidence, or there is a mistake, or it is a person who should never have been charged to begin with. But I think your answer, I don't know if there's any solution. You can't take jurors and keep them in a hotel and lock them up until the trial is over. That's what they used to do. 50, 60 years ago, if you were in a high-profile case, jurors were sequestered. They were kept in a hotel, no television, no newspapers. They were kept under armed guard if there was a very, very high-profile case. You can't do that anymore. You now have to, I trust you. And I have found jurors in the highest profile cases where I have been involved. I have found jurors who have stood up and said not guilty, despite terrible media. And in all of those cases, there's been a reason. Because if they follow the law and they listen just to the evidence in the courtroom, it was the right verdict. If they listened to what was in the newspaper, they would never vote not guilty. So I think the answer is we have to give them instructions and we have to trust them. Yes?
What does the ethical code of the lawyers tell us about managing the media in high-profile cases or in general?
The Bar Association has a code of conduct, and the ethical considerations, and I think it's Rule 3.4 or 3.6, the ethical rules require that you not make statements about the facts of the case in a sufficient way with sufficient detail to influence the outcome of the case as you are going closer and closer to trial. So you are permitted to stand up. You are permitted to stand up and say, my client is not guilty, and he or she intends to go to trial, and we are confident that he or she will be acquitted. You're permitted to say that. I am permitted to say that there was no element of force involved, and therefore no crime was committed, because that's saying he is not guilty. But what I would not be permitted to do is stand up and say, these are the reasons that my client is going to be exonerated. And now what's of interest is the same rules apply to the lawyer for the plaintiff or the victim. And yet in our case, the victim was on television, on national television, every day, describing exactly what she claimed my client did, with a lawyer sitting beside her. So the rules are not always enforced, but I think if you lose your credibility as a lawyer in the United States, you never get it back.
In what issues do they issue gag orders? In what cases do they issue gag orders?
I've been in cases where they issue gag orders, and in a way it's a blessing. Because what you can say when you come in and out of the courtroom, I'd love to answer your question, but I'm not permitted to do so. So there have been...
Basically, you're ignoring.
I'm sorry?
Basically, you're ignoring the media.
You cannot ignore the media because they are in your face. But what I have learned is that if you learn how to deal with the media, you can make a no-comment soundbite that helps your client. For example, in the Puff Daddy case, we had a modified gag order, meaning we couldn't talk about any witnesses' testimony or any facts in court. What we were permitted to do is repeat each day that our client was not guilty. So we would walk into, this was an 8-week trial. We would walk into court every day, and 400 reporters would stick a microphone in my face, and they'd say, what do you have to say about yesterday's testimony, Mr. Brafman? Was it good for Puff Daddy? Was it bad for Puff Daddy? And I would say, we are confident that at the end of the trial, my client will be acquitted. We have maintained from the beginning he was not guilty. We maintain now that he is not guilty. Now, I have not violated the gag order. I have not answered the question. But what I have said is that yesterday's testimony did not change my outlook on this case. So have I commented on the credibility of that witness from yesterday that alleged bad by him? Yes, because I've said we maintain from the beginning and we maintain today, meaning nothing that's happened in the last couple of days has changed my mind without actually saying it. So you can ignore the media, but if you completely ignore the media, what happens, and someone mentioned this, I think Mr. Feldman mentioned it, this is the problem that you have. I am his lawyer. I am responsible for everything that comes out of the defense camp. The police department in New York City has 40,000 members, and the district attorney's office has 600 members and 400 support staff. So if I leak something, it's going to come back on my desk, and I am held responsible by the judge. If I am a prosecutor and a detective, without my permission, says something to their friend, the reporter, who they may have a relationship with, and the reporter reports it, the prosecutor can stand up in court and honestly say, I did not speak to any news member, and I did not authorize the release of any information. Many judges then have no recourse. What are you going to do? But if I'm alone, everything that happens is my responsibility. So do the rules apply the same? No. The police department orchestrates the Perp Walk that is known. When Strauss-Kahn was walked out of the courthouse after his arrest, within hours of his arrest, before anybody knew whether he was guilty or not guilty, they waited until all the press came to the precinct before bringing him out in the pouring rain with his handcuffs, not shaven, that picture that everyone saw around the world. It was an indignity. But you know what? It happens in every case. They didn't do it just for him. Every person who is arrested in New York, everywhere in the United States for that matter, is publicly walked out of the building so that if the media has an interest, they can get that shot. Is it wrong? Yes. The people in France were outraged because in France, when someone is accused of a crime, the investigation is done quietly. Then if they determine that there are going to be public charges, then they announce the public charges. But you never see someone in Europe before they are charged even in handcuffs looking as if they've already been convicted. So it's a problem we face, and it's something we have to deal with. But it's never going to change. In my lifetime, it's never going to change because the public wants it. The public wants to see Dominique Strauss-Kahn in handcuffs, and that's the emes. That's the sad commentary on society. It has nothing to do with the prosecutor or defense lawyer. The general public thrives on this. When someone drowns at the beach, there is a lifeguard trying to save him, and there are 200 people who want to look to see the person is dead or not. It is a bad character flaw. We are intrigued by other people's sorrows, unfortunately. That's where we should look first if we want to really try and solve this problem. Thank you very much.